So, in the drama you've been watching, one of the detectives became convinced that a witness was being deceptive and based on this hunch, sought a confession from the witness. Is it sound to rely on such hunches? Can we really tell if people are lying to us? And does this mean that one of the reasons why police seek confessions using stronger interview strategies is because they know who is guilty? Well, some researchers, such as Roche Zapfton-Hart in 2010, argue that this might be part of the issue.
If I thought someone was innocent or knew nothing, I would release them immediately.
In the following video, you'll see a witness make some statements. When you watch this video, I want you to try and decide whether the person is telling the truth or not.
I'm not quite sure why I'm here.
You ran from the murder scene, Scott, and that's why you're here.
Now, hang on, mate.
You hang on, mate.
me.
There's a dead girl lying on a cold bit of steel refrigerator, and it's my job to figure out who the hell put it there. Now sit back down.
You can't prove I took that bag. Maybe somebody nicked it.
I'm guessing that the majority of people will think that the witness was being deceptive. How can you tell whether someone is telling the truth or not? One of the things that people think you should pay attention to when trying to detect a lie is nonverbal behaviour. The idea is that when verbal and nonverbal messages do not match, the nonverbal behaviour is a better indicator of the truth because it's harder to control. Why is it so hard to control nonverbal behaviour? Well, there are relatively automatic links between emotions and nonverbal behaviours, so if you experience the emotion of fear, for example, you might then display a particular facial expression or body movement without conscious control of those expressions and movements. The other issue is that people are relatively unaware of what normal nonverbal behaviour is, and so are not well practiced at controlling nonverbal behaviour. So it's harder to make your nonverbal behaviour match your relatively controlled verbal behaviour when you're actively trying to look like you're not being deceptive. This leads us to two important questions. Are there systematic differences in nonverbal behaviours between liars and truth tellers? And are observers aware of these cues? And also, perhaps most importantly, are observers able to detect deception using these cues? The answer to these questions needs to be yes for observers to be able to detect deception from nonverbal behaviour. There are basically three theoretical frameworks for answering these questions. The first is the emotional approach proposed by Paul Ekman in 1985. This perspective suggests that being deceptive causes certain physiological reactions such as high blood pressure and increased heart rate. These reactions are the result of heightened arousal associated with guilt, fear, or perhaps excitement. It's also this arousal which is thought to affect nonverbal behaviour. The second approach is Burgoon and colleagues' cognitive approach. According to this perspective, being deceptive is a cognitively complex task, and because of the cognitive load associated with deception, body language gets neglected. As a result, there's a reduction in the overall amount of movement, slower speech, and more pauses in speech. The final approach is DiPaolo's attempted control approach, or the self-presentation perspective as it's sometimes called. This approach argues that deceivers will try and control their behaviour, but because they're not very practiced at being deceptive, their behaviour appears more rigid and inhibited. The interesting thing here is that these three approaches all actually predict different and sometimes contradictory behaviours as markers of deception. The emotional approach predicts that increased movements will be associated with being deceptive. The emotional and cognitive approaches predict an increase in speech disturbances as being associated with deception. Whereas the attempted control approach suggests that there should be a reduction in movement. So what does the research actually say happens when people are being deceptive? Depending on the study, deception is associated with more speech disturbances and slower speech rate, as in DiPaolo and colleagues' 1989 study, or fewer speech disturbances and faster speech rate, as in Vree's 1995 study. As it turns out, speech rate and number of disturbances depends on the type of lie that is being told. Fabrication of false information, rather than just concealing the truth, is actually harder to do and so leads to more speech disturbances and slower speech rate. Voice pitch, on the other hand, does seem to be relatively uniformly associated with deception. What about nonverbal behaviours like body movements? Vree's 1995 study tells us that when people are being deceptive, we tend to see less movement of the hands, arms, feet and legs. This study also tells us that gaze, Smiling and shifting position are not really reliable indicators of deception. And so the old adage about looking up to the left as a marker of deception is probably not supported by the results of systematic research. Is that all that is associated with deception? Well, some people argue that due to the limits of what you can do in an experiment in the laboratory, we can't understand the full range of behaviours associated with deception. For example, for ethical reasons, it's difficult to create situations in the laboratory that have high stakes or important consequences for participants. It can also be difficult to create situations where participants have high levels of motivation to get away with a lie, or high levels of motivation to detect a lie, as they might in real life. What we know from other types of research, like observational studies, however, is that high stakes for getting away with a lie do not tend to produce more nervous behaviour. This can be seen in studies by Davis and Haddock in 1995 and Vree and colleagues in 1996. Some of that research actually showed that Saddam Hussein decreased his movements when attempting to get away with a lie. Highly motivated liars do behave in different ways, however. They show fewer body movements and slower speech rate, higher voice pitch and more speech disturbances. Finally, we also know that people who had time to plan their lie behaved differently. Zuckerman and Driver's 1985 study showed that planning was associated with fewer arm and head movements, shorter response latencies and faster speech rate. So the next question is whether observers can actually tell when others are lying or not by paying attention to these nonverbal cues.
With about 3/4 of people, I can tell if they're lying pretty much instantaneously. A hand comes near the mouth, or a swallow before an answer. Is eye contact suddenly different? Does the person repeatedly look off to the left as she searches for true answers to questions, then suddenly look off to the right when she gives one particular answer?
So to come back to our question, can people detect lies? Although there are some exceptions, which we'll talk about soon, the answer is generally that people are no better than chance at detecting deception. Bond and DiPaulo report an average lie detection accuracy for laypersons of 54% in their 2006 study. It's not just lay people though. People who work in law enforcement, such as police officers and customs officials, also perform at chance levels, as shown in research by Kraut and Poe in 1980. There are some exceptions to this, however, such as Secret Service agents and some members of the intelligence community, as Ekman and O'Sullivan observed in 1991. But the general rule holds that people are no better than chance. Now, why is that? Well, let's start by asking the question in a slightly different way. What nonverbal behaviours do people think are linked with being deceptive? Vree and Semin in 1996 asked professional lie detectors, students and prisoners this very question. They found that prisoners were significantly better at identifying the cues associated with deception compared to the other two groups of participants. Now, what is one reason for this? Well, professional lie detectors such as the police might not perform better than non-professional lie detectors because they don't get very good quality feedback on whether somebody is actually being deceptive or not. In investigations, it can be very difficult to know with absolute certainty what exactly went on. And as we've heard, even when we have a confession to a crime or an eyewitness identification or account of events, these may be misleading for a whole range of reasons. It's also possible that prisoners are particularly good at lie detection because it's more essential for them to do this well. It can literally mean the difference between life and death. Now, lack of training might also contribute to the relatively poor deception detection performance for some groups. Porter, Woodworth and Burt in 2000 looked at the role of training. They found that training, practice and feedback in detecting the nonverbal indicators of deception all actually improved accuracy. Mann, Vree and Bull in 2004 also showed that more experienced officers performed better than less experienced officers, and they also performed at better than chance levels. Experienced officers were able to detect deception with an accuracy of 65%. So in sum, people in general are not very good at detecting deception, and with a few very special exceptions, they're really no better than chance. You may as well be guessing. Interestingly, even though people are generally not very good at detecting deception, people are confident in their ability to detect lies, as research by Vree in 1993 shows. Unfortunately, the correlation between confidence in ability to detect lies and accuracy in detecting lies is not very strong. Why is this? Well, observers generally think that deception is associated with increased speech disturbances, high-pitched voice, longer latency during speech, and looking away, which is also called gaze aversion. And they also think it's associated with increased body movements. Now, from the start of this presentation, you'll know that voice pitch is the only one of those behaviours that is reliably related to deception. Speech disturbances and latency periods are related to deception, but the nature of the relationship changes with the different types of lies that can be told. And in fact, you'll also know that it's actually decreased body movements that are associated with deception. So why do people think that these things are associated with being deceptive when they might not be? Probably because they're all markers of being nervous, and as Knapp and colleagues showed in 1974, people assume that liars will actually be nervous. Essentially, the problem is that people have a stereotype about what it means to look deceptive, and parts of that stereotype are accurate, as for voice pitch, and parts of that stereotype are inaccurate, the other cues that we talked about. Interestingly, some of our research that was published in 2013 actually suggests that people are most influenced by the parts of the stereotype that are inaccurate, and they largely ignore the parts of the stereotype that are accurate. Now, this makes it really hard for people to accurately detect deception. Having been rather pessimistic about observers' abilities to detect lies, there are a few ways that people can be more accurate in this task. We've already heard how training in deception detection and just generally having more experience at it helps to improve accuracy rates. Ekman and O'Sullivan argue that if you train people to specifically pay attention to micro-momentary expressions of the face, you can increase their ability to detect lies as well. Sleepin and colleagues' 2013 study of poker players' ability to detect deception suggests that cues unrelated to the face might be more useful. They found that observers were more accurate at identifying the quality of other poker players' hands by paying attention to the hand movements when placing bets rather than the players' faces and upper bodies. So perhaps we need to stop focusing on the eyes and other facial features. Perhaps consistent with this, Porter and Brink in 2010 argue that paying attention to multiple cues rather than just a single cue can improve lie detection ability. On the other hand, Reinhardt and colleagues' 2013 study suggests that observers should avoid consciously trying to attend to cues at all and rely instead on unconscious processing of multiple cues. In their study, unconscious decision makers, that is people who are kept from actively thinking deliberatively about detecting deception, actually perform the best and at better than chance levels. So perhaps telling people to actively pay close attention to verbal and non-verbal behaviour or demeanour is not necessarily the best way to detect deception. This is a point made originally by Messner and Casson in 2004. Apart from these avenues for potentially improving deception detection, is there some other way we might be more accurate that doesn't rely on perceivers' own perceptions of non-verbal behaviours? What about lie detection machines? We'll talk about the polygraph and other such machines in the next presentation.